between then and now, I would say that the situation in many ways has evolved much more positively. Certainly, some of the anxieties which we had at that time about the unfulfilled trajectory of our economic development at that time was still a matter of considerable concern. Certainly, towards the end of the 1990s, I remember, we were still not sure how far we would be able to have a sustainable development path, even though there were promising signs emerging at that time. Poverty was still rampant. Inequalities, of course, had already begun to emerge. In fact, around about 2001, I gave at Dhaka University the Najmul Kareem Memorial Lecture, which I titled From Two Economies to Two Societies, because at that time we were already visualizing the emergence of elite class, singular growth in social and economic disparities, and a significant departure from one of the central elements of the vision of the liberation struggle, which was incorporated into the four founding pillars of our Constitution. Today, the situation, I would say, is significantly better in a number of areas. I will talk about that. But the basic focus of my presentation to you is to address what we would regard as some of the unfulfilled elements of that struggle. Now, if you look at the struggle, and if you look at how it was incorporated, the vision underlying that struggle, the vision of Bangabandhu himself, was incorporated into our Constitution. We emphasized four elements in that: democracy, secularism, nationalism, and socialism. Socialism itself was loosely interpreted at that time. And I would, for all practical purposes, look at our understanding of socialism as the construction of a society based on justice. In my reflection on this vision, I would say that the two elements which should concern us, which remain part of an ongoing struggle, which is still to reach its fulfillment, relate certainly to the areas of democracy and the realization of a just society. And this is really what I will focus my remarks on. Now, Bangabandhu, you may remember, in his historic speech on the 7th of March, had spoken about two Shangrams, Ebar Shangram, Mukti Shangram, Ebar Shangram, Shadinata Shangram. Shadinata Shangram was clearly understood and was part of the fulfillment which was attained on the liberation of the country, on the proclamation of independence and the eventual liberation of the country. We have attained rank of a sovereign status, and we may proudly proclaim our sovereignty over these 52 years. The first part, Mukti Shangram, was a more nuanced presentation. We understand what is Shadinata, but by Mukti, my own reckoning would be, and what was perhaps intended by Bangabandhu, was that he believed that Mukti lay in liberating the people of Bangladesh, not just from the tyranny of Pakistani rule, but from the tyranny of centuries of exploitation and injustice. and the creation of a democratization, not just of our politics, but of economic opportunities to be faced by the people. And this was, I think, a very central element in his own vision of an independent Bangladesh. So, what I will talk about today is the ongoing struggle to realize the construction of the just society which was envisaged by Bangabandhu and which was recognized and enshrined in our constitution. But before I more substantively look at this, I would want to address the more positive sides of our liberation struggle. Looking back 52 years at the conditions which prevailed at the time of our liberation, and even looking back another 25 years, we should recognize that quite significant transformations have been registered. In the paper I will be eventually presenting, which will emerge out of these talks, I will identify some of the critical elements of our advance, but one or two figures which come to mind relate, for example, to comparing ourselves with Pakistan and what has happened there. If you remember, a great deal of the struggle at that time was all about the wide economic disparities which existed. And at the time of liberation, in fact, Pakistan's per capita income had advanced from about 30% in the beginning of the 50s to about 60% ahead of the Bangladesh per capita income. Now, if you look at the numbers today, our per capita income is about 60% ahead of Pakistan. Our GDP, which was again significantly behind Pakistan at that time, I think has also now significantly moved ahead. And in many other developmental indicators, whether we are looking at our export growth and diversification, our GDP growth, our growth in social indicators, in all these areas, we have advanced very significantly. And in some areas, we have even moved ahead of India. Certainly in some of our, depending, of course, I mean, much of this depends on the sort of calculations you use. But during the COVID period, some numbers were even being presented that our per capita income had even crossed India's. And certainly in terms of the progress in our human development indicators, whether we are talking about healthcare, whether we are talking about education, whether we are talking about gender advancement of women, in all these areas, Amartya Sen and his colleagues have actually written and commented on the fact that we have moved ahead of India in these areas. So Pakistan itself is a long way behind us now. And if you look at the comparison of the trends in the Pakistan economy compared to ours, anyone who has talked to Pakistanis recently, particularly economists, are all deeply conscious of how well we have advanced compared to them. Now, advances should not only be recognized just in terms of macroeconomics, but should be recognized in terms of the social and structural transformation that has taken place of a country which was once upon a time dependent on the almond crop for feeding itself and jute exports for sustaining the growth of its economy. We have now quadrupled our food grain production. We should recognize ourselves as being self-sufficient, though we are not, because there is a difference between being self-sufficient and being food secure, and that is a problem which needs to be addressed. And we have greatly diversified our agricultural sector. We have expanded the composition of the rural economy. In fact, today, the output from the rural economy is the non-agricultural sector has bypassed the agricultural sector, indicating the diversification which is taking place. And in many other areas, growth is expanded. In fact, while we all recognize the singular contribution of ready-made garments, where we are the second largest exporters in the world, what is very significant is the diversification of the economy in many other areas. I mean, for example, no one would have imagined that where we had one steel mill, the Chittagong steel mill producing 100,000 tons of steel, today we have got steel mill manufacturing capacity of 8 million tons. So these are some of the numbers which you take into account. Now, over and above this, you have witnessed the emergence of a much more dynamic society. In fact, we have perhaps we need to be recognized as a society of entrepreneurs, where at all levels now people have come forward and have participated in the economic transformation of the country. When I talk of entrepreneurs, I do not limit myself to talking about the garment manufacturers and the other sort of big business houses, but the hundreds of thousands of small-scale and medium entrepreneurs who have actually emerged, and not just the entrepreneurs as defined by the textbooks, but I recognize as entrepreneurs the working women who have come out of their rural homes and have constituted a dynamic labor force. I recognize the 15 million migrants who have gone abroad, mostly coming from poor backgrounds, who have become the mainstay of our balance of payments. These are who we should recognize, the millions of women who have improved their lives through accessing microcredit and demonstrated themselves as credit-worthy participants in the economy. So these are some of the very positive elements which we recognize and which have transformed Bangladesh and held out prospects for singular advancement. I mean, we take pride in saying that we have graduated out of the ghetto of the LDCs, the least developed countries, and are now a middle-income country with aspirations to rise even higher. How far we will do so will depend, I think, on some of the issues I'm going to cover. But more to the point is, the fact that we can have such aspirations today is a measure of our advancement. Now, what then remains to be addressed? What is the unfinished part of the liberation process? And I think the areas where we need to recognize that our progress has left, you may say, a very large ground to be covered, relate to our democratic process, and relate to the growth of inequalities and the aggravation of injustices in our society, which have contributed to and perpetuated the social and economic disparities which now inform our society. Now, here, in a very interesting paper contributed, I think, by Rehman, which will be appearing in a publication which has been edited by Raunak Jhan for VIDS commemorating the 50th anniversary of Bangladesh. Zillur, in fact, made a very interesting remark that at the time of liberation, our main anxieties related to the trajectories of our economic development and enormous uncertainties and tensions which confronted a war-devastated economy. We were at that time much more confident about the trajectories of our political direction, particularly the consolidation of the democratic process. Our assumption at that time was that a country which has struggled over these 26 years of their association with Pakistan on the struggle for democracy would in fact make this the centerpiece of their system of governance once they became a sovereign country. We should keep in mind that the liberation struggle itself originated in the attempt to build a democratic society in the denial of democracy, which was a singular element in the creation and perpetuation of economic disparities and the political injustice. Because in order to create that unequal society, it could only be done through a process of denial of democracy. And this was therefore the first area of struggle of Bangabandhu and his colleagues. It was our failure to realize democracy within the Pakistan state, which eventually culminated in a liberation struggle which ended up in an independent Bangladesh. So, looking at the state of democracy, we see that over a 52-year period, we have not really been able to consolidate and to build a sustainable democratic system and culture in our society. After 52 years, we are still trying to work out an acceptable system of holding elections. Who would have thought that this would have been a matter of central concern? Our inability to construct a workable system of holding elections has led again to a process in which throughout the decade of the 80s and periods of cantonment rule, you had a situation in which the concept of a free and fair election became completely alien to our consciousness, and it required a massive political mobilization to eventually get us back on the democratic path. I remember when I used to meet colleagues from Pakistan in the course of the 1980s, one of the first things they would always tell me is that how is it possible that after all those years of struggle in Bangladesh, you have ended up being ruled by the cantonment. You can understand this happening in Pakistan. How did it happen in Bangladesh? And I must say that I could never provide a very satisfactory answer at that time. But then we went through what we believed was our second liberation and our democratic renaissance in 1991. And our expectation was that this would lead to a new age for us. I participated in the first caretaker government at that time under Justice Shahabuddin. And our whole experience was at that time a largely experimental experience. We did not really expect or we were sure how this would work out. But I remember Nikhil Chakravarti, the editor of Mainstream, one of the leading left magazines in India, who came as an election observer, pointing out that that election, which he was there as an observer, was probably the freest and fairest election he had actually witnessed in his whole life. He was then in his 70s and just died a year after being there. And the experience with that inspired the struggle by Sheikh Hasina for establishing a system, institutionalizing the system of elections under a caretaker government. And the end result of a 2-year struggle, political struggle, was the enactment of a constitutional amendment for elections under a caretaker government. And that was a campaign led by the current Prime Minister and a broad spectrum of the political opposition at that time. And It was, in order for that to come about, it required a consensus between the two main parties, the Awami League and the BNP, and that itself was a singular achievement. The establishment of system of elections under caretaker system, of course, led to the holding of relatively free and fair elections. Now, I mean, people may debate how free or fair elections actually are, but for me, I have two yardsticks of a free and fair election. One would be that it is contested by two or three major parties with a credible possibility of capturing state power. And because they are major contestants, the outcome of the election process will remain uncertain right to the end. The moment predictability is introduced into an election process, you have doubts about the credibility of that process. And of course, the second and most relevant outcome is whether an incumbent government is then displaced and an opposition party then ascends to power. If you look at the elections of 91, if you look at the elections of 96, of 2001, and of 2009, in all those cases of elections under caretaker government, opposition party actually came and held office. Now, needless to say, for reasons which have never been entirely made clear, we chose to do away with the system of caretaker governance. And the outcome, of course, has been sort of visible enough. I mean, we have had two elections whose credibility has certainly been questioned, not just here, but internationally. And we are now facing the possibility of election again whose outcome is very clearly predictable. I mean, obviously, if the major opposition party is incarcerated or is in a fugitive condition, and the only contestants are going to be people from the ruling Gharana, or people who are uncertain about their political identity and have what you may say a Janus-like face, where with one side of your face you are the opposition and with the other you are an election partner where you solicit for being gifted seats to contest the election. No one can take that sort of political party very seriously. So at the end of the day, we are facing the possibility of a third election in which the basic preconditions for a competitive and inclusive election are not really going to be fulfilled. Now, arising from this, we may point out that further problems which were associated with the democratic process also related to how we practice democracy even in the good years where we had contested and credible elections. In the period where we had parliament with some element of an opposition in it, parliament did not really satisfactorily discharge the responsibilities which were expected of it. Here, there was both the government of the day and the opposition, in fact, had some responsibility. The government did not of the day, and there were successive governments who, in fact, did not really create the space necessary to accommodate the concerns of an opposition. And the opposition, instead of using parliament as their instrument of struggle, chose to take that struggle onto the streets. So that parliament itself, even when it was the outcome of a democratic process, then became essentially dysfunctional entity where the primary responsibility of holding the government of the day accountable on a daily basis and to challenge their areas of malgovernance and to come forward with suggestions of how this could be improved. These were responsibilities which did not originate in Parliament. I don't know how many of you will remember but probably throughout the period of the first 15 years of democratic rule, and even after 2008, it was very rare that you had the national budget discussed in Parliament. In fact, one of the positive outcomes of establishment of CPD was that was one of the few places, particularly in the 1990s and in the next BNP period, where you could bring the finance minister and his counterpart together to have a public debate on the budget. But that was not the appropriate place for budgets to be discussed. It should have been discussed in Parliament, which of course never happened. And of course, in a situation where you are not being exposed to challenge, the culture of that sort of legislature undergoes itself a sort of mutation and a change. I mean, what we have essentially witnessed over all these years is that very rarely are the important issues of the day now discussed in Parliament. I mean, how many of you can recollect a major discussion on the default crisis? How many of you can recollect a major discussion even on the way in which we handle our healthcare system during periods of emergency? A whole range of other critical issues of national importance. There is really no substantive discussion in Parliament. This is a very natural place for this to have been held. At the same time, we see that if you are then not addressing issues of national importance, Parliament itself then gradually begins to change its character. And in fact, it becomes really an arena of opportunity and the pursuit of material advancement. The whole transformation in the character of our legislative class from being sort of middle-class people of modest means. I ask you to think of if Bangabandhu and Tajuddin Ahmad were invited to declare their wealth and income status at the time they were contesting elections in 1970 or even in 1973, what would you have expected to have received? Now, of course, we have been witness to the declarations which are made, which itself, I presume, are somewhat underestimated, because not all dependents are, in fact, actually cited in these declarations. And in spite of the limitations of these declarations, the figures that are emerging are really, boggle the imagination. Now, this essentially means that the whole character of Parliament, not just those who are there, but those who aspire to be in Parliament, has changed. Mostly, they are self-proclaimed businessmen. They are there to further their business interests. And the fact that incomes may have increased by a factor of 200 or 700% should not be occasion for too much surprise. Because if you are a self-declared businessman, then presumably you will be using your presence there to advance your business fortunes. And this is what has happened. And this culture has now percolated down to all levels of elective office, all the way down to the Union Parishad, where actually being in power is a very central factor in being able to advance your business fortunes. So whether you are participating in a tender for a particular project at the Union Parishad or Zilla Parishad level, or whether you are actually participating in some business opportunities which have been opened up over there, your political identity has become a very relevant factor. Now, all these elements indicate that even if you are wanting to practice a system of capitalism, I mean, there is no debate now that Bangladesh has fully embraced the idea of constructing a capitalist society. If you are constructing such a society, even within the framework of capitalism, you can have a distinction between what you would call competitive capitalism, which functions according to the rules of the market, and a system of what the economic literature has now termed as crony capitalism, where it is being practiced by using your access to power in office in order to then advance your business fortunes. So here, in such a society, you are witnessing an element of injustice, even in the practice of capitalism within a market-based economy. And this is one of the concerns that we have. Now, in my own writings and in my own concern, I challenge the very nature of capitalist society and say that it is in the nature of a capitalist society that it should in fact create and perpetuate injustice, because that is what capitalism is all about. But what I would say is that even within capitalism, there are certain rules of the game, and if these rules are consistently violated for purposes of self-advancement, and you use power and privilege and patronage to do that, then the system itself begins to malfunction, and this is a grave danger. Certainly, you will see that there is strong tendency. In none of this, when I'm talking about all this, I'm not just talking about the current situation. I'm talking about a situation which in fact has evolved over the years, going back even into the Irshad regime, where you have basically created the foundations and the nature of a crony capitalist system. Now, here what I would say is that in such a system, inequalities are inevitably going to grow, and even the regulatory contribution and impact of a market mechanism, market-based system, is not going to function very effectively. So the discussion which now goes on about the growth of inequality, everyone is talking about this, not just us, but even the international community who have themselves contributed to the creation of such a system, all remain in quest of building what they hope will be a less unequal system. Well, obviously you are not going to build an unequal system if you have got unequal and malfunctioning democratic process, because the system of accountability to an electorate where the great majority of people are not from the privileged class is going to ensure that you will be answerable for accumulation of unexplained sources of wealth. You will be challenged in the process of holding elections, and you will be challenged through the outcome of the electoral process. Now, here we see that these developments, in fact, are not available to us as a resource for, in fact, holding people who are holding power, not through a meritocratic and functioning democratic process, but through their ability to invest resources, to use those resources to deploy coercive mechanisms to ensure your electability, and at the end of the day, create a system in which the whole the whole elective class then becomes a privileged elite, and the vast majority of essentially disenfranchised population then has very little say in determining the character of the people who will represent them. Now, all these, such a process, and I will not go on much longer, have certain consequences. And the central consequence has been the emergence, creation, and perpetuation of unjust society. Now, the elements of this injustice are to be found in the malfunctioning of the institutions of governance, because you are not keeping such a system constantly accountable. The very institutions which you have established, which create the foundation, the pillars around which functioning democracy in a system of acceptable governance can take place, are really not in place, and where they exist have been progressively weakened. Now, I would quickly identify some of the areas that this would happen. If you look at some of our key institutions, now for example, in relation to elections, you will be talking about the Election Commission. Related to the Election Commission are two other agencies. One would be the Anti-Corruption Commission, one would be the National Revenue. Now, I saw somewhere in some newspaper 2 days ago when questions were raised about the astronomical increases in the reported wealth of the electoral contestants. I think the Election Commission was asked, what are they doing about it? And the Election Commission said, well, we are doing nothing about it, but we don't think that we have the responsibility to do anything. So the relevant question would then be, so then who has the responsibility to inquire how come someone's wealth has increased by 700%? Someone should be responsible. And of course, logically then, the two institutions would be the NBR and the Anti-Corruption Commission. But the fact that none of these three institutions were really mentioned as possible institutions which could be expected to discharge their designated responsibilities indicated that in one statement coming from the Election Commission, three institutions were effectively proven to be unable to discharge their designated functions. Now, this obviously is a matter of some concern. I mean, if you look at the functioning, for example, of the Anti-Corruption Commission, logically speaking, it shouldn't have been left to the election process where people have to, once every 5 years, declare their wealth status. A functioning Anti-Corruption Commission should be looking at a whole range of people, not just a few selected people, in most cases associated with the opposition, but should be looking at the legislatures, which should be looking at the people who are in running the machinery of government, whether in law enforcement or in the administration, and should then be identifying their wealth and income status and should then be investigating this. I mean, becoming wealthy is not a crime. The important issue is how you accumulate that wealth and how transparently this process is actually investigated. So this action should be an ongoing responsibility, and that the people who are being investigated should not just be selected and underprivileged people, but virtually everyone, so that the law and the functioning of institutions should be applied to all citizens, whoever they may be, and these institutions should function with complete independence without fear or favor. A similar situation relates to the functioning of our judicial system. Here again, the essence of a functioning judicial system is represented by the statue, which is, I think, remove that statue, at least from public view, but in many law courts around the world, you have the statue of justice with a blindfold over their eye. A system should be that the blindfold should cover both your eyes. When you go into a system of one-eyed justice, where you can only see the injustice of some people, but you do not see the injustice of a whole range of other people, then that is not an acceptable system of functional justice. If you in fact have a system of law enforcement in which some people will be made the beneficiaries of a proactive law enforcement system, but others who may be as conspicuously liable to the attention of law enforcement authorities but do not get to see them, again you have a problem. So the whole law enforcement system, to be a functioning institution, must actually discharge its responsibilities with a degree of consistency, with a degree of integrity, and with a complete indifference to the political identity, or for that matter even the financial capacity of the people with whom you are actually doing business. This is a functioning system which is dedicated to proclaiming the rule of law. Similarly, you would look at institutions like the central bank, which are really expected to be regulating the functioning of the financial system. Now, we have been witness to what has now become part of our vocabulary, the default culture. Now, whilst we are seeing this today, and much is talked about, I wish to point out that the antecedents of the default culture go back to the regime of President Ziaur Rahman. In fact, studies which I did at the IDS involving various people, including one of them, Binayak Sen, sitting there, actually identified defaults which were being built up and accumulated and unattended at the time of the Zia regime, during the Ershad regime, and then which continued through the democratic era down to the present. So that as a consequence of defaults becoming established as, in fact, defaults becoming institutionalized. I mean, the institution of the central bank was to see that you regulated the financial system. So this then becomes part of a process, and you are seeing the outcome of this. Now, in a functioning, well-banked central banking system, it would be the responsibility of the central bank to monitor this and to see that such a process does not become an accepted norm. You would see to it that when you assign banking licenses, you do not hand this out as if you are distributing candy to children. You are looking at this and creating a system in which credible banking institutions are established. Today, Bangladesh has more banks than India does, simply because we have been indiscriminate in the way we have distributed banking licenses, and you have situations in which banking conglomerates controlling 7 or 8 banks then come into existence and then do not even run them with efficiency or integrity. So all these reflect the failure, an institutional failure, and the creation of an unjust economic system in which an elite is permitted to default on loans. The most credible borrowers happen to be at the base of your system, the microfinance borrowers with repayment rates of 80, 90, 95%. So such a system is neither efficient in market terms, nor is it a just system, and certainly it is an inappropriate vehicle in which to aspire to graduate to becoming a developed society. Now, let me end by saying that at the end of the day, the injustices that I have identified are manageable injustices. I mean, when I write about injustice, and I have written about this in my book on challenging the injustice of poverty, I discuss structural injustices in society, the inequalities in ownership of assets, the inequalities in the malfunctionings of a market mechanism, the inequalities in education, the inequalities in healthcare. These require much more revolutionary changes, much more radical system of political mobilization, and I'm not talking about that. The issues that I have talked about are manageable because all these areas are part of the existing laws of the land. No law says that default of loans is an acceptable system. No law says that when you tender for projects, privileged people will be benefited through that particular process. No law says that when you are in fact distributing resources from the budget, a great part of that budget will in fact be invested in subsidies and tax rebates for the elite compared to the investments which are made in public distribution system. All these are part of a government agenda which is committed to the reduction of poverty, which is committed to the just operation of the financial system, which is committed to using a budgetary process which is fairly distributing public expenditures. And in all these areas, if a government sets out and commits itself to discharging its responsibilities under the Constitution, none of these injustices should prevail. After all, if you look at the democratic process itself and the electoral system itself, at the end of the day, the electoral system is grounded in the Constitution itself. And all parties are publicly committed and constantly proclaim that it is their task to, in fact, both establish and perpetuate democracy. So when we ask for a just society today, all we are asking for, at least in the first phase of realizing a just society, is that you enforce the existing laws of the land. All that you do is let the institutions which have been established to sustain the process of governance, let them do their job. And you let this process work itself out. I mean, I will conclude with a simple example. If you look at the system of khas land distribution, Bangabandhu enacted laws in his tenure that all khas land would be retained by the government and distributed to the least privileged, landless and land poor people in society. Now, we have been through so many decades of appropriated khas lands in which all sorts of people have illegitimately captured khas lands. And even though there are laws of the land stating that khas land should be distributed to the landless, very little has been done. Some political parties have briefly led struggles to get khas land to the poor, but basically you need a system of law enforcement which enforces laws which are already on the statute books, a system of governance which sees that those who have illegally captured these lands are in fact appropriately punished. And this would then be a quite simple and doable system, needing no land agrarian revolution. So this is an area which could be, we could extend this particular prospect to many other areas of the economy and systems of governance, where you simply set out to do what you have committed to do, implement policies that you yourself have legislated, and make the institutions which are in place function as they are intended to do. If we could do this, at least we would have made a significant step forward to the realization of a more democratic and a more just society. Thank you.
এলো মুক্ত চিন্তার স্বাধীন দৈনিক খবরের কাগজ। এখন খবর হবে নিখাত, নির্ভীক, নিরপেক্ষ।